It begins in a hospital room at night, with a man resting peacefully on a white pillow. He is 59 years old. He is the most famous face on the planet, and in a few hours he will be dead. He lay his head back against the pillow, the hospital administrator would later tell reporters, and that was the end. The world would learn the news by morning. Crowds would gather. Newspapers would print it in letters an inch tall. The king of Hollywood was gone. But the headline that day missed the quietest fact of all. In a room down the hall, his wife lay resting too. She was 5 months pregnant. The child she carried would never be held by the man the entire world had just lost. Listen carefully now, because this story does not begin with a birth. It begins with the promise of one and the silence that swallowed it whole. You know the face, even if you have never seen the man. Rhett Butler. The wide-brimmed hat, the careless laugh, the line every actor since has tried to borrow. Clark Gable carved that man into cinema in the late 1930s, and for 2 decades afterward, nothing in Hollywood could move without bending toward him. Producers, directors, the cameras themselves seemed to know which way to turn when he walked on a set. He had been married 4 times. He had outlived a war. He had outlived, in some quieter way, his own heart. Because before all of it, before the ranch and the 5th marriage and the desert in Nevada, there was Carole Lombard. She was the 3rd Mrs. Gable, and the one the history books cannot finish writing about. In January of 1942, she climbed onto a commercial flight home from a war bond rally. The plane never made it. She was 33 years old. Gable was told the news in a way biographers still find hard to describe in print. What is documented is what followed. Within months, he enlisted. Not in some comfortable stateside role designed for a celebrity. He went into the United States Army Air Forces. He flew real combat missions over Europe during the Second World War. A man in his mid-40s, sitting in a bomber that German guns were trying to kill. He would tell people later that he had nothing left to lose. Friends who knew him said the war was the only thing that kept him moving at all. He came home. He worked. He carried on. But the people who loved him said a particular light had gone out, and it never quite came back. And then, more than a decade after Lombard's death, he met Kay. Kay Williams had already been married and divorced 3 times before their paths crossed. She had 2 children from earlier chapters of her life, and she had seen enough of Hollywood to know what a name like Gable really cost. Still, something drew them together, and in 1955 they married. It was his 5th time at the altar. It was her 4th. Friends described it as an unlikely pairing. They also described it, once they had been together for a while, as the most settled he had ever seemed. They settled into his ranch in Encino, California. 22 acres of dry California ground, fenced and private, the kind of place where a man could pretend the rest of the world was just noise. The marriage was not a glittering headline. There was no Lombard-style spectacle. What it gave him, by every account that survives, was something he had never quite had before. A home that stayed still. A woman who stayed put. Stepchildren who began to call him something close to a father. He embraced the role, those close to the family said. He was not a man who had ever been famous for tenderness. And yet with Kay's children he softened in a way cameras had never caught. He learned, late, what a quiet house sounded like when it was full. By the late 1950s, Kay's children were growing up on the ranch, and the household had found its shape. Gable kept working. He was still one of the biggest names in the business, and the offers kept coming, and he kept taking them, because he had always taken them. But there was a new thing happening underneath all of it. A private thing. A thing that had nothing to do with cameras. In 1960, Kay became pregnant. The word that biographers keep returning to is joy. Gable told people on set, in those few unguarded moments, that the coming child felt like grace. He had been a father in name only to Kay's older children. This would be different. He said so himself. He was filming the Misfits at the time, out in the Nevada desert, the last major picture of his career, a strange and brutal little western about broken men and harder women. The director was John Huston. The co-stars were Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift. It was the kind of cast that read like a future obituary. Gable himself knew it was probably his last great role, and he told a reporter on set that he was ready to walk away from the movies entirely once filming wrapped. He said he planned to go home. He said he planned to be there for the birth. He said he wanted to be a presence in the earliest years of his son's life, not a photograph on a hallway wall. He called the pregnancy, in the words that made it into print, a wonderful gift arriving late in his life. That phrase is one of only 2 real quotations that survive from those months. And you should hold it, because it is the last clear sentence he ever said to a reporter about who he wanted to be. A few days into November of 1960, while Kay was about 5 months along, Gable suffered a serious heart attack. He was admitted to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital, where the doctors worked to stabilize him. By the next morning, the bulletins were cautiously hopeful. He was awake. He was talking. Kay stayed at his bedside and rarely left the room. Friends came and went. Nurses came and went. The world waited. For about 10 days, the world kept getting the version of the story it wanted to hear. He was resting. He was improving. He was going to be fine. On the evening of November 16th, Kay and Gable shared dinner in his hospital room. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about that sentence. A man and his pregnant wife, eating a meal, talking about the small things married people talk about in hospitals. After dinner, Kay stepped across to a nearby bed in a room down the hall to rest. It was late. The doctors had given no warning. The night nurses had no particular alarm. A short time later, Clark Gable suffered a second massive heart attack. The hospital administrator, who would give the only public account of those minutes, told reporters what the staff had seen. Gable had appeared to be resting comfortably, sitting up in bed. He had simply laid his head back against the pillow. There had been no struggle, no cry for help, no dramatic final scene at all. Just a man who had been talking with his wife an hour before, settling back into his pillow and stopping. And that was the end. He was 59 years old. The news traveled faster than the wire services could keep up. It reached New York before midnight, local time. By morning, the headlines were already running in London and Paris. In Hollywood, where stars rose and fell every season, this one felt different. This one felt like the closing of a chapter. The man who had carried the industry through the Great Depression and the Second World War was gone. And the public who had watched him on screens for 2 decades did not quite know what to do with the silence he left behind. For Kay, the silence was immediate and personal. She was a widow at 35. She was 5 months pregnant. She had not yet had time to absorb the first loss when the second one arrived, the one that would last the rest of her life, the one that would arrive 4 months later in a hospital delivery room without the man who had promised to be standing beside her when it did. On March 20th, 1961, in a Los Angeles hospital, Kay gave birth to a son. She named him John Clark Gable. He weighed just over 7 pounds. He had his father's wide eyes, although no one would say that in print for many years. He would grow up to say, in interviews much later, that he had no personal memory of the man whose name he carried. No recollection of a laugh in a hallway. No recollection of a hand on the back of his head. Only photographs, yellowing at the edges. Only stories told to him by other people, mostly on anniversaries, mostly in soft voices, mostly about a man who had been planning, in those last weeks of his life, to do the one thing he had never done before. Be there. Instead, John Clark Gable would have to piece together a father the way a restorer pieces together a damaged painting, from other people's recollections. From films that had been shot decades before he was born, from the particular way strangers looked at him when they heard his last name, as if they already knew him, as if they had been waiting for him without realizing it. And here is the question this story will keep asking, quietly, across every part that follows. If a man plans to give his child the only thing no amount of fame or money can buy, and then he dies 11 days before the child is even conceived, in fact, 4 months before the child arrives, what kind of presence does that absence become? What does a son do with a name he will never hear spoken by its owner? What does a mother do with a promise she has to keep alone? And what does the world do with the idea that one of its great romantic leading men was, in the end, a man who simply laid his head back on a pillow in a quiet hospital room and stopped? The answers are not simple. They are not the kind that fit on a magazine cover. They will take us from a ranch in Encino to a hidden half-sister the tabloids had been chasing for 30 years. To a grandson who would carry the name into a new century, and to a private grief so heavy it bent 3 generations of the same family in the same direction. Stay with this story. The next part opens on the same ranch, a year later, with a small boy behind a locked gate and a mother who will not let him out of her sight. Because someone, just before he could walk, tried to take him. The boy was still learning to walk when someone tried to take him. That is the sentence the family has lived inside ever since. Not a famous sentence, not a sentence that ever made a headline, just a small, sharp fact, dropped into the middle of a much larger grief, and from that fact an entire childhood was quietly built. After Clark Gable died in November of 1960, Kay Williams Gable did not leave the ranch in Encino. She had no reason to. The property sat on 22 acres of California ground, walled and private, and within those walls she had already begun the business of being a widow with a baby on the way. The staff who had worked for her husband stayed on, at least for a while. The grounds were quiet. The gates stayed closed. The world outside the property did not stop to be polite about it. The world kept wanting pieces of the king of Hollywood, and now that he was gone, the world wanted pieces of his child instead. When John was roughly a year old, an attempt was made to kidnap him. You will not find the full story in any single place. It surfaces in fragments across interviews, across family recollections, across the careful sentences Kay Gable used in the rare moments she chose to talk about her son at all. What is documented is enough. Someone, for whatever reason, attempted to take the boy. Whether it was a ransom plan, a celebrity fixation, a tabloid scheme, an extortion attempt against a grieving widow, the records do not fully clarify, and the family has never clarified it either. What is clear is the result. From that moment on, John Clark Gable was not a child who wandered freely into the world. He became a child who moved, when he moved at all, inside a ring of security. The personnel were not theatrical about it. There were no obvious guards in dark suits. They were men and women who knew the property, who knew the routines of the household, who accompanied the boy and his mother whenever they left the gates, and who watched the perimeter when they did not. It would have looked, from the outside, like the kind of quiet wealth that simply has help. From the inside, it would have felt like the slow closing of a cage. And here is where this story stops being a Hollywood fairy tale and starts being something else entirely. Because the boy inside those walls was not being raised in the loud, glittering style of the famous names the press loved to print. He was being raised in a kind of soft captivity. He had his half-siblings from Kay's earlier marriages around him on the ranch, and he had his mother, and he had a small, tight circle of people his family trusted. What he did not have, for almost 2 decades, was a normal life outside those gates. You have to feel the strangeness of that for a moment, because it is the whole shape of his childhood. He was the son of the most recognizable man in the history of motion pictures, and he was being raised in deliberate invisibility. Other children of the famous grew up in flashes, magazine spreads, birthday parties printed in the society pages, school plays photographed by paparazzi. John Clark Gable grew up behind a wall. The only glimpses the public got were the glimpses the family chose to give, and even those were rare. In April of 1961, when John was still small enough to be held in one arm, Kay made one of those careful choices. She allowed a photograph of the infant boy and his mother onto the cover of a national magazine. It was the first public introduction of the son of Clark Gable to the American public, and it was managed down to the lighting. She wanted him seen. She did not want him hunted. The magazine cover circulated, the world looked, the world cooed, and moved on to the next cover. Kay went back to the ranch and shut the gate. For 11 years, that was the public image most people would carry of John Clark Gable, a magazine cover from when he was a baby. A name that everyone in the world already had an opinion about. Then, in May of 1972, the boy stepped briefly back into the open. He was 11 years old. The occasion was the premiere of a film called The Cowboys, a John Wayne Western that had been released earlier that year and was being celebrated in Los Angeles. Kay took her son with her to the event. Photographers caught a frame of the two of them standing together on the carpet. The boy was tall for his age. He had his mother's coloring. He had his father's eyes. He looked, to anyone who cared to look, like the heir to a name that had not cooled in public memory in the 12 years since the man who owned it had died. It was the photograph most people would remember, if they remembered anything at all, for the next stretch of his life. A magazine cover when he was an infant, a red carpet snapshot when he was 11, almost nothing in between. You could count the public appearances of John Clark Gable during his childhood on one hand, and you would have fingers left over. He did not attend school in the usual way, or at least not in the usual schools. He did not play Little League in city parks. He did not have the ordinary accidents of an ordinary boyhood, the kind you can only have when you are allowed to fall in ordinary places. His childhood was shaped by who his father had been. And his father had been a man so famous that even his grave was a tourist stop. And yet he had no memory of the man. None. He had been a few months short of being born when the second heart attack came. He had never heard his father's voice say his name. He had never been picked up, in those first weeks of life, by the hands that the rest of the world had watched on movie screens for 20 years. He was the inheritor of an entire emotional mythology that he could not himself verify. He had to take it on faith. He had to take it on photographs. He had to take it on the way his mother, in her careful way, told the story. John would say later, when he was old enough to be interviewed about it, that it was a strange experience growing up as the child of a man the whole world already felt it knew. The word he used, when interviewers pushed, was something close to haunted. Not by his father, by the idea of his father. By the version of Clark Gable that lived in other people's memories, in other people's living rooms, in films he could watch himself now that he was old enough to press play. He would meet his father, in a sense, for the first time as a teenager, sitting alone in front of a television set, watching a man his own age who could not possibly have been his father die in the arms of a woman on a burning staircase in Atlanta. He would have to learn the man from the back of the catalog, the way you learn a grandparent you never met from the box of pictures in a closet. And so a particular kind of discipline settled over him early. He did not chase the spotlight. He did not try to cash in the name. He grew up quiet, polite, private, watchful. Friends of the family said that what he wanted, more than anything, was to be allowed to be ordinary. What he got, because of the kidnapping attempt and the gates and the guards and the fear, was a kind of careful invisibility instead. But the story does not end there, because even as John was growing up quietly behind the ranch walls in the 1960s and the early 1970s, an entirely separate secret was being kept, at the same time, in another part of California, by another set of famous hands. It is the kind of detail that the public did not catch for decades, and that even insiders only whispered about. Two of the biggest names in classic Hollywood had been carefully guarding a truth for almost as long as John Clark Gable had been alive. The secret involved a sister he did not even know existed, a sister whose last name, by deliberate design, was different from his own. A sister who had been brought up in the public eye as an adopted child, in a household that knew exactly who her father was and who her mother was, and was prepared to lie about it forever. John did not know about her. The family did not tell him. There were reasons. There were always reasons in this family, but the reasons had less to do with John and more to do with the machinery of stardom, with the studios and the contracts and the publicists and the delicate machinery that kept the golden age of Hollywood running on schedule. And so, two children of the same famous man were growing up in the same state, in the same decade, breathing the same California air without knowing that the other one existed. One was a son, hidden behind gates because someone had tried to take him. The other was a daughter, hidden behind a story because her mother had been afraid to let her be seen. Two different kinds of cages, the same architect, in a sense. The same man, at the root of it, who had died in a hospital bed before either of his youngest children could remember his face. Stay with this. The next part opens in 1935, on a film set in the woods of Washington State, where the man at the center of all of this is about to make a choice that will not surface in public for almost 60 years. A man kisses a little girl on the forehead and walks out of her life. She keeps that kiss for the rest of her days. But who she is, and what she has been told about herself, and what her mother has hidden from her, is a story the family is not ready to tell out loud just yet. The name of the film where it all starts is Call of the Wild. The name of the woman is Loretta Young. The name of the daughter is Judy. And the name of the father is the name John Clark Gable carries without knowing where it came from. You have to go back 35 years before the boy was born to find the beginning of this thread. The year is 1935. The man at the center of the story is 34 years old and already the most famous face in American cinema. The woman is 22 years old and a devout Roman Catholic, a girl who had been working in pictures since she was a teenager and who already understood, with the instinct of someone raised inside the studio system, that the machinery of stardom does not tolerate mistakes. They are on location in Washington State, filming Call of the Wild, and Loretta Young is about to make the choice that will quietly restructure the rest of her life. Clark Gable was married to someone else at the time. That part is not in dispute, and it has never been in dispute. What happened on location and what happened after has been whispered about in Hollywood for generations. The brief, intense relationship between the two of them produced a pregnancy. That pregnancy, in 1935, was not a complication the studios were prepared to handle gracefully. Careers had been ended for less. Marriage contracts had been voided for less. The gossip columns had made whole fortunes out of less. For Loretta Young, the calculus was sharper. She was Catholic in a way that was not a label. It was a structure she lived inside. Her faith informed every public decision she made in a town that made it very easy to abandon private ones. The options the studios typically proposed, in those days, for unwed stars with inconvenient pregnancies were not options she was willing to consider. So she made her own choice, and she made it alone, and she made it in a way that would cost her daughter decades of confusion. She sailed for Europe. She would wait out the pregnancy in private, far from the columnists and the studio fixers and the photographers who would have sold her out for a single clear photograph. By the time the baby arrived, in November of 1935, the public had been told nothing. The studio had been told nothing. The father, by then, had been moved on to his next picture. What happened to the newborn is the part that takes the longest to absorb. Loretta Young placed her baby daughter into an institutional setting and walked away. The records describe a circuit of hideaways and foster arrangements that ran for 19 months. 19 months is not a short time. It is a year and a half. It is the entire span between a baby lifting her head for the first time and a baby walking across a room on her own. That is how long Loretta Young kept her daughter out of her own home, even though she had a home that could have held her, even though she had the means to care for her privately, even though she had already decided she would not give the child up. She brought the baby home at last. She introduced the girl to the world. She named her Judy. And then she began the work of concealment. This is the part that has been examined across decades by biographers, by psychologists, by the daughter herself. Loretta Young was not careless about the truth. She was meticulous. Judy was presented as an adopted daughter, a fact that was not unusual for the era and not difficult to defend in public. The cover story held. It held through Judy's earliest years. It held through her first days of school. It held through the small and large events of an upper-class California childhood in the 1940s and 1950s. But children do not stay children forever, and faces do not stay faces forever, and Hollywood is a town that remembers everything. There is a particular physical feature that became a problem for Loretta Young: the shape of a child's ear. Judy had her father's ears. Not metaphorically, not in some vague family resemblance way that the columnists could wave off as coincidence. She had the wide, distinctive ears of Clark Gable, and as her features grew more defined, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. Mothers in the schoolyards, the hairdressers, the minor stars who saw them both in public. The whisper began as a low hum and slowly built into a chorus. Loretta Young responded with the precision of a publicist who understood that prevention was cheaper than scandal. When Judy was 7 years old, an operation was arranged. The corrective ear surgery performed that young was not medically urgent. Its real purpose was quieter. It was meant to quiet the rumors. If the ears were less obvious, the resemblance would be less obvious. If the resemblance were less obvious, the story would lose its traction. The surgery worked, in the way that these things work. The resemblance was muted. The rumors did not stop. They simply went underground, where they would wait, patient and undisturbed, for the rest of the century.
Judy grew up in a beautiful lie. She went to good schools. She was taken to the right places. She appeared in the right photographs. She was introduced, when introductions were required, as the daughter of Loretta Young by adoption. There is no public record of her suspecting the truth in those early years. There is no record of a child too young to understand the machinery that surrounded her. The single meeting that survives in the public record happened when Judy was 15. She was at her mother's house in Beverly Hills, and Clark Gable came by. The encounter, by every account Judy would later give, was brief. He asked her about her ballet lessons. He asked her about her schoolwork. He leaned down and he kissed her gently on the forehead. Then he left the room and he left her life. Judy remembered the kiss for the rest of her days. She described it, in the memoir she would eventually publish, as one of the most vivid and the most precious memories of her childhood. She remembered it because it was warm, and because it was rare, and because she had no way, at 15, of understanding that this man was not a family friend being polite. She had no way of knowing that he was her father, in anything but the formal sense. She had no way of knowing that the kiss on her forehead was, in some cold and silent way, the only thing he would ever give her. The truth stayed buried for years after that. Judy moved into adulthood with the story she had been given. She married, she worked, she became a mother herself. The whispers in Hollywood did not disappear. They found her at parties. They surfaced in conversations she could not quite track down to a source. She began slowly to suspect. She began to ask, in her own quiet way, the kinds of questions that change everything once you start asking them. The Labor Day weekend of 1966. That is the date Loretta Young finally spoke the truth out loud. She did it in private. She did it in a room, mother to daughter, with no cameras and no lawyers and no studio fixers anywhere in sight. She admitted the truth. Judy was not adopted. Judy was her biological daughter, and Judy was the daughter of Clark Gable. By that point, Gable had been dead for almost 6 years. John Clark Gable, the son he never saw, was 5 years old and already behind the gates of the Encino Ranch. The hidden daughter and the hidden son were both alive in the same state, breathing the same air, separated by 25 years and by the fact that neither of them knew the other existed. Loretta Young had spent more than 30 years constructing the lie. She did not take it apart easily. She did not promise her daughter any kind of public reckoning. She did not even promise reconciliation. What she did was tell the truth. Once, in a single conversation, and then close the door again. Judy kept the secret. She was a married woman by then, with a career of her own, and the world did not know what she had just learned. She went on with her life. She worked in soap operas, including The Secret Storm and General Hospital. She trained, later, in psychology. She became a psychotherapist who specialized in adolescent counseling, and the colleagues who knew her well noted, in the careful language of professionals, that the work did not seem accidental. The work looked, to people who paid attention, like the work of a woman trying to repair in other people's children what had been done to her. She kept the truth inside her for almost 3 more decades. In 1994, Judy Lewis published a memoir called Uncommon Knowledge. The book laid out the full story in public, for the first time, in her own words. The press covered it, briefly, as a Hollywood scandal. It was more than that,
and it was less. It was a daughter writing down the cost of being hidden by her own mother, in the hope that putting it on the page would make the carrying of it lighter. The book came with a price. Loretta Young, by then in her 80s and in the final stretch of her life, reportedly refused to speak to her daughter for 3 full years after the memoir was published. The silence was not a misunderstanding. It was the consequence of a daughter who had decided, after carrying the secret for nearly 30 years, that she would not carry it anymore. Reconciliation, when it came quietly and just in time. Loretta Young died in August of the year 2000, and the public record suggests that mother and daughter had spoken again before that final parting. There is no record of what they said to each other. There rarely is in families like this one.
The machinery of stardom had run on silence for 65 years. It could be forgiven for taking a few more months to wind down. Judy Lewis continued to work as a therapist. She continued to live with the story that had been told about her and the one she had finally told herself. She died on November 25th of 2011 at the age of 76 after a battle with lymphoma. The death certificate is a piece of paper. The story she had carried since 1935 was something larger. Now widen the frame. For John Clark Gable, the existence of this half-sister added a layer that almost no other family in the country had ever carried. He was a man whose father had died before he was born.
He learned, somewhere along the way, that his father had also fathered a daughter who had been hidden from him by one of the most powerful studios in the business, and that the daughter had lived a parallel life of concealment on the other side of Los Angeles. They were siblings by blood, separated by 25 years and by the strange, careful machinery of 2 very famous careers. Neither of them had ever been allowed to know their father in any real way. Both of them had spent their lives trying to figure out who he was from the wreckage the world had left behind. 2 children, 2 cages. One father who had died in a hospital bed in 1960, never knowing how many children the public would eventually count him as having. Stay with this. The next part follows John into adulthood, into the desert, into the back of a race truck at 3 in the morning, and into the strange, stubborn project of building 2 careers that have nothing to do with the name he cannot escape. Because the name will not let him go, and he has spent his whole life trying to outrun it. The desert, in the middle of the night, has a way of making a name irrelevant. There is nothing out there but the dust and the headlights and the engine noise that you have to lean into if you want to keep moving. There is no audience. There is no reputation. There is only the next 100 miles and the question of whether your rig is going to hold together long enough to see them. John Clark Gable found something in that, and he found it early, and he held on to it for most of his life. You have to understand the problem he was trying to solve. He had been born into a name so heavy that strangers felt entitled to a piece of him simply because they had seen the man it belonged to on a screen. He had been raised behind ranch gates because someone had tried to take him before he could walk. He had grown up watching his own father in old movies, learning the shape of a man he had never met from a catalog of celluloid. By the time he was old enough to choose a life, he had a very clear sense of what he did not want. He did not want to be a famous son. He did not want to be the answer to a trivia question. He did not want to stand in front of a camera and be measured against a man whose shadow he could not possibly fill. So he went the other direction. Off-road racing is not a sport that hands out applause.
The Baja 500 and the Baja 1000 are punishing tests of endurance run across the deserts of the Baja California Peninsula. Hundreds of miles of broken ground, dust so thick at times you cannot see the truck in front of you, suspension systems pushed to the edge of what engineering will allow. They are races that ask something serious of the people who enter them, and they do not care who your father was. You either finish or you do not. The desert does not know about Hollywood. John Clark Gable competed in those races for years. He became serious about it. He built relationships in that community that had nothing to do with the ranch in Encino or the photographs on his mother's mantle. Friends who knew him well during that stretch of his life said that the racing was where he felt most himself, most unencumbered, most like a man who had earned the right to be in the room by what he had done with his hands and his hours. The trophy case at the end of that era would matter to him in a way that the magazine covers never had. It was a deliberate choice, and it was the right one, and it was not quite enough. Because the name does not let you go, not really. Not in a country that has been watching your father on screens for 60 years. The pull of the industry that made your family what it is does not stop at the gate of the ranch. It waits. It is patient. And somewhere along the way, John Clark Gable decided to walk into it on his own terms. His feature film debut came in 1990 in a modest western called Bad Jim. The picture was not a major studio production. It did not need to be. What it needed to be was a door, and it functioned as one. He shared the screen with James Brolin, a veteran actor who had nothing to prove, and Richard Roundtree, an actor who had already done more than his share to redefine what a leading man could look like. John played a character named John T. Coleman, and the name was an accident the press enjoyed for about a week. The film did not find a wide audience, and it did not need to. It got him onto a soundstage. It got him through the first audition of his adult life. It got him to the place where he could decide with some clarity whether this was a career he wanted or just a visit. He kept acting. He took smaller roles in independent productions across the following decades. None of them came close to the scale of his father's career, and the distance was not an accident either. He had watched, from a distance, what that scale had cost. He had seen what happened to a man who let a career swallow his home life. He had been the infant in the hospital room when the price of fame was finally paid. He was not going to repeat the pattern, even if repeating it would have paid better. So he ran 2 careers in parallel. He raced in the desert. He acted in small pictures. He lived mostly out of public view. He married. He raised a family. He did the work that did not require him to be Clark Gable's son, and for a stretch of years it looked like he had managed something almost impossible. He had managed to be the heir to a name without being owned by it. Then came the night that pulled the name back. In 2013, John Clark Gable was arrested in Malibu on charges connected to driving under the influence of alcohol. The incident, by the reports that made it into the local press, involved his vehicle striking several parked cars before he was taken into custody by deputies from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. There is no public detail about the night that would not be familiar to anyone who has ever known someone in the grip of a bad decision. The kind of evening where the distance between the parking spot and the road ahead seems shorter than it is. The kind of evening that ends with a phone call you do not want to make. What made this particular incident a story was not the incident itself. Malibu sees hundreds of driving under the influence arrests every year. What made it a story was the name on the booking sheet. John Clark Gable, son of, grandson of nothing. The booking sheet did not say any of that. The press did. The press ran it on every front page that wanted to remind its readers that the king of Hollywood had a son, and that the son was not a statue.
and that the son was a man who had made the same kind of mistake that men without famous fathers made every Friday night in cities across the country. The difference was that the mistake had a name on it that they could sell. It is hard, if you have spent your whole adult life trying to build a private self, to watch a single bad night turn into a national headline because of the 7 letters at the end of your name. Friends who spoke about that period said it was the kind of thing that bent a man, not because of the arrest itself, because of the reminder, because of the way it confirmed what he had been fighting against for decades, which was the stubborn, exhausting fact that no matter what he did, no matter how carefully he lived, no matter how many races he finished in the dust, the name was always going to be the loudest thing about him. He had built 2 careers to escape it. He had raced across deserts to outrun it. He had stepped into his father's own arena and tried to do it on a smaller scale, with humility, on his own terms. And in the end, a single bad night behind the wheel in Malibu was enough to pull it all back onto the front page. With a photograph, with a headline, with a quotation from a deputy who did not care who his father was. The pattern, by that point in his story, had become familiar. The man who had been a stranger to his own son. The man whose name had been hidden from his daughter. The grandson who had been raised behind gates because someone had tried to take him. And now the grandson himself, sitting in the back of a sheriff's cruiser on a Pacific Coast highway, with the same name on his chest that the world had been reading about for the better part of a century. The desert had not saved him. The independent films had not saved him. The careful privacy had not saved him. The name had waited, and the name had its moment. There is a particular cruelty in that, and it is the cruelty that runs through this entire family. You can do everything right. You can refuse the spotlight. You can build a careful, modest, hard-working life. You can compete in races that nobody watches. You can take the small roles instead of the big ones. You can raise your children quietly. You can avoid scandal for decades at a time. And then one night, one mistake, one moment of bad judgment, and the machine that has been circling your family since before you were born wakes up and reminds you, very politely, that it never went to sleep. John Clark Gable came out the other side of that night. He paid whatever prices the courts and the calendar required. He went on with his life. He went on racing. He kept building things, quietly, in the desert and on the small screens of independent productions. But the question he had been asking himself since he was old enough to understand his own situation did not get any easier. What does a man do with a name he did not earn and cannot refuse? How do you build a life inside a name that was made famous by a man you never met? How do you compete fairly in any arena when the audience already knows the answer before you have started? Stay with this story. The next part moves from the man to his children and to the strange, hopeful moment when the family name passed into a 4th generation, and to the young man who took it into television and tried, like his father before him, to make it mean something different than it had meant before. Because there is a grandson, there is a great-granddaughter. There is a man named Clark who works in front of cameras and who has decided, against considerable evidence, that the name can still be made new. Stay with this and pay attention to the date, because the family is about to be tested again. The grandson was born in the fall of 1988, and they named him Clark. Not Clark Jr., not Clark II, just Clark, with a middle name added so that the family line, on paper, ran from the original king of Hollywood into a boy who would grow up carrying the most famous first name in American cinema without having ever met the man who made it famous. You have to feel the weight that this boy was born into, because he carried it differently than his father had. John Clark Gable had been born into the name as a kind of inheritance he had to figure out how to hold. Clark James Gable was born into the name as a kind of mission. His grandfather had been dead for almost 30 years by the time he arrived. His father had spent his whole adult life trying to outrun the surname. Clark James, by every account that survives, decided to do the opposite. He decided to wear it forward. His father had been married 3 times. The first marriage, in 1985, was to a woman named Tracy Yarrow, and it was the only one that produced children. A daughter, Kay, arrived in 1986. A son, Clark James, arrived on September 20th, 1988. The marriage did not survive long after that. By the early 1990s, John and Tracy had parted ways, and John was back on the road between Encino and the desert, doing the work of 2 careers in 2 hemispheres of the entertainment industry. The children, by every report that surfaces in interviews and family recollections, were raised with a particular kind of attention. The attention of a man who knew what it felt like to grow up without a father present, and who was not going to let that happen to his own children if he could help it. The second marriage, to Alexandria Remlin, ran from 1999 to 2002. The third marriage, in September of 2020, was to a woman named Deborah Hartzell, and it continues. 3 marriages in a life that has now stretched into the mid-60s. The arithmetic is not unusual for a man of his generation. The arithmetic is also, given the family history, almost impossibly normal. It is the son who carries the story forward in this part, because the son is the one who decided to step in front of a camera. Clark James Gable grew up into a tall, easygoing young man with a face that photographers liked and a willingness to work that ran in the family, although not, perhaps, from the family he was named for. He tried acting. He tried modeling. He tried the work of being on television in the way that television was hiring young men with famous names in the early 2010s. He became, for a stretch of years, one of the most recognizable hosts of a particular kind of reality programming. The show was called Cheaters. You have probably seen the format even if you have never seen this particular show. People who suspect their partners of being unfaithful are filmed with hidden cameras, catching the suspected partner in the act. The host confronts the cheater. The cameras roll. The audience at home watches the unraveling. It is messy, it is loud, it is built on the oldest premise in the world, which is that people want to see other people's worst moments caught on tape. Clark James Gable became the face of that show for a stretch, and he did the job with the kind of confident, easy authority that the format rewards. He was the man in the room who asked the hard questions. He was the man the cameras framed when the lie cracked open. He was, in the strange economy of the program, the personification of consequence. He was the man who arrived to make sure the deception did not survive the episode. It is worth sitting with that because the irony is heavy. A young man named Clark Gable, who had been raised by a single father after his own grandfather died young, who had grown up watching his father outrun the family name, who had decided to lean into it instead, became, for a living, the man who confronted other people's betrayals on camera. The cameras loved him back. He was telegenic. He was tall. He had the kind of presence that translates well into a tight shot. He had, by every available measure, the face of the job. He ran a men's fashion boutique at one point. He tried his hand at modeling. He did the things that young men with famous names and uncertain industries tend to do in their 20s. None of it quite settled into a single shape, and the public could be forgiven for not knowing quite what to make of him. He was a Gable. He was not the Gable. He was somebody's grandson who had decided to be in pictures anyway. And then, in the fall of 2017, he became a father himself. His daughter was born on September 6th of that year. They named her Loretta Gable. The name carried no obvious echoes of the family mythology. It was a name for a new generation, a name that did not have to carry the king of Hollywood inside it, a name that could be whatever the girl who wore it decided to make of it. For John Clark Gable, the moment was not abstract. He had been a child who never met his grandfather. He had been a young father who had lost his first marriage but managed to stay close to his children. He had lived long enough to see his son build a career, find a partner, become a television presence, and now become a father in turn. For a man who had spent his whole life navigating what it meant to inherit a name, watching his son become a father was the kind of moment that suggests the wheel can be turned. The family had been through the gates, and the kidnapping attempt, and the hidden sister and the desert races and the bad night in Malibu. The family had outrun a lot. Maybe, just maybe, the family could outrun the rest of it. His granddaughter was a year old when her father brought her out into the world. She was a year and a half old when she had a grandfather who had buried his own father and had never quite stopped grieving for the man he never knew. She was a child in a family that had been written about for 60 years, that had been whispered about for 100, that had produced one of the most famous faces in the history of motion pictures, and had then spent the better part of a century trying to figure out how to live with what that face had cost. For a brief stretch in the late 2010s of this century, it looked like the family had, against considerable odds, figured it out. The grandson was working. The grandson had a daughter. The grandson had a fiancé and a name and a future that looked, from the outside, like a future. John Clark Gable was still racing in his 60s. His daughter Kay had begun to follow the family into entertainment. The ranch was quiet, but it was the quiet of a family at peace, not the quiet of a family in hiding. Stay with this image. The young father, the small daughter, the career, the television show, the boutique, the sense, fragile but real, that a name which had carried so much weight for so long was finally carrying something light. Because the story is about to turn again.
In the winter of 2019, the family is going to be tested in a way that none of the public scripts, none of the careful narratives the family had been writing for itself had prepared them for. The young man who had confronted other people's betrayals on camera for a living is going to be revealed in the worst possible way as a man who had been carrying a private burden that no one outside his closest circle had known about. The man who had been the face of consequence is going to become, very suddenly, the man the cameras turn on next. The date that ends this part is February 22nd, 2019. The location is a house in Dallas, Texas. The man they will find is going to be the grandson of Clark Gable, the son of John Clark Gable, the father of a little girl not yet 2 years old. And what they find is going to break the family open in a way that the older tragedies, even the loss of the king himself, did not quite manage to break it. Because the older tragedies had been visible, they had been public, they had been processed in the slow machinery of celebrity into stories the world could tell itself about Hollywood and loss and the cost of fame. This one is going to be private. And it is going to stay private in a way that makes the public reckoning almost impossible.
The next part opens on a morning in February. A fiancé, a bedroom, a phone call. Stay with this story. The circle is about to close in a way that none of them saw coming. The morning of February 22nd, 2019, started the way mornings do in houses where a young father lives. There was coffee. There was a fiancé, Summer, moving through the rooms. There was a daughter, not yet 2, somewhere in the house or somewhere nearby, beginning the ordinary business of a day that would not become ordinary. Clark James Gable did not wake up. When Summer found him, he was unresponsive in the bed. The details that matter in moments like that are not details, exactly. They are textures. The kind of room, the kind of light. The quiet that is the wrong kind of quiet. The quiet that tells you, before the brain has finished catching up, that something has already happened that you cannot undo. Paramedics were called. He was rushed to Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas. The emergency room did what emergency rooms do, and none of it worked. He was pronounced dead the same morning. He was 30 years old. You have to feel what that number means inside the family that has been carrying this story. The grandfather died at 59. The grandson died at 30. The arithmetic of it is obscene. The number itself, 30, is obscene when you stack it against the century of Hollywood mythology that produced him. The official findings came from the Dallas County Medical Examiner, and they were made public in the weeks that followed. The cause of death was an accidental overdose. The substances involved were illicit: fentanyl, oxycodone, and alprazolam. The combination is a combination that has ended thousands of lives across the United States in the past decade. It is the combination that has defined, in a statistical sense, the opioid crisis that has been reshaping the country since the early 2010s. The name attached to this particular death was a famous one. The mechanism of the death was not unique. That is the part of the story that the public was not quite ready for, and that the family has been carrying in private ever since. The press coverage was immediate, and it was not kind. There were headlines that reduced a young man's entire life to a single finding. There were photographs. There was the inevitable comparison to the grandfather who had been dead for almost 60 years by then, and who had, in the popular imagination, never done anything wrong. The young man who had been the face of a show about confronting betrayal was now, very publicly, the subject of a different kind of confrontation. The cameras that had framed him when he cornered a liar were now the cameras the public used to look at him. The man who had been the consequence in other people's stories was now, in his own story, the man the consequence had come for. For John Clark Gable, the loss was not a headline. It was a hole in the floor of his life. You have to hold both halves of this man at once. He is a man who grew up never knowing his own father. He is a man who buried his only son at 60. He is a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun the name he was given, and who now had to live inside the latest consequence of carrying it. He had lost his father before he was born. He had lost his son in a way that no family should have to absorb. The pattern, by that point, was no longer a pattern. It was a weight. It was the weight of a century of being a Gable and of paying, in private grief, for every public celebration of the king that had come before him. The grief inside that family is not the kind that fits inside a magazine profile. It is the kind that lives in the hallways of the houses in Santa Barbara and Malibu, where John Clark Gable now lives. It is the kind that sits at the edge of a hospital bed. It is the kind that does not get smaller with time. It is the kind that gets reshaped. In the years since Clark James Gable died, his father has continued to live the life he built.
he has continued to race. He has, by accounts from the off-road world, secured multiple championship titles across a competitive career in the Lucas Oil Off-Road Racing Series, which is the kind of sentence that makes sense only if you remember that the desert was where he went to feel like himself. He is now in his mid-60s. He is one of relatively few living direct links to a legacy that most people experience only on a screen. He has described, in international interviews, the strangeness of having the entire world feel a sense of familiarity with a man he never had the chance to know. He has talked about reconstructing an entire relationship secondhand, from films and photographs and the recollections of people who were there. He is a man who has had to learn his own father from the back of a catalog. He is a man who has had to bury his own son. He is a man who has had to do both of those things in public, under a name that will not let him go. His daughter, Kay, has followed the family into entertainment. Her filmography includes work in productions such as Winchell, The Cynical Life of Harper Hall, and Sunset Society. She is a working actor in an industry that has been part of her family for 3 generations, and the irony of that is its own kind of weight. She grew up watching her father try to outrun the surname. She grew up watching her brother try to wear it forward. She is now the one who has had to keep the family name alive in a public arena at a moment when the public has been reminded, again, of how heavy that name has always been. The granddaughter, Carole Gable, born in 2017, is now a young girl who will grow up knowing her father through photographs and through other people's recollections, the same way her grandfather grew up knowing his father, the same way her great-aunt, the daughter Loretta Young, kept hidden for 30 years, grew up not knowing her own father at all. The cycle, in some sense, has begun again. The name has passed through 3 generations of absence and has now produced a 4th generation that will have to decide what to do with it. Look back across the whole arc now. A man in a hospital bed in 1960, promising to be present for a son he would never meet. A daughter hidden in another part of California, raised as someone else's child by a mother who chose the lie over the scandal. A boy raised behind the gates of a ranch because someone tried to take him before he could walk. A young woman raised behind the machinery of a Hollywood studio, learning the truth about her father only when she was already grown. A son racing across the Baja to outrun a name. A grandson wearing the name on camera, building a career in front of audiences, becoming the face of consequence in other people's stories. A young man in a bed in Dallas who could not be saved from the combination of substances that have been killing people across the country for a generation. A grandfather now who has had to bury his own son. The grandfather's classic films are still screened. They are still studied. They are still shown to young actors who want to learn what a leading man looks like when the camera is in the right hands. Almost a century after his rise, his work survives. The name, in the public imagination, still carries the warmth it carried when he was alive. He is the king of Hollywood. He will always be the king of Hollywood. What the public did not see, what the public has never quite been able to see, is what the name cost. What it cost the daughter who was hidden. What it cost the son who was born into absence. What it cost the grandson who wore it forward and could not outrun the country he was living in. What it cost the grandfather who has had to absorb all of it, in private, in houses in California, for 6 decades. The King of Hollywood had a story. The story is bigger than he was. The story is older than he was. The story is the one his family has been living inside since before his son took his first breath. And the story is still being written.
There is no version of this family in which the loss stops. There is only the version in which the loss is named and held and carried in public for long enough that it stops being a private shame and starts being what it actually is, which is a very human story about a very famous family that has been paying in private grief for the public joy of a man who died at 59 in a hospital bed with a pregnant wife down the hall, 4 months before his son was born. Stay with this. Carry it the way the family has had to carry it. Because the name was never the inheritance. The absence was. And absence, it turns out, can be passed down for 100 years.